This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Seneca Network from the China Project. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, and some people are wise, some otherwise. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese grammar wiki, sinosplice.com, and is a man who'd kill for a Nobel Peace Prize. Let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you here from Utah in the United States.
Hey everybody out there, my name is John Pasden. I'm in Shanghai, China.
Well, John, you know what? I'm trying to think of something pretty clever to start out this episode here, but I think that's just the perfectionist in me.
It doesn't have to be perfect, Jared.
It doesn't.
It just has to be useful.
It has to be useful indeed. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about.
Right. I think probably many of our listeners can identify with this issue of being a perfectionist. It might affect your work, might affect your hobbies, and it might affect your learning of Chinese. And I think there are some times when it really slows you down, it hampers you. But there are some times when maybe it's not the worst thing.
So today we are going to talk about perfectionism and how sometimes to use it to your advantage, but also some things that, some barriers to maybe jump over and overcome on those perfectionist tendencies as you're going about learning Chinese.
So, Jared, I understand you did a bunch of research on perfectionism to dazzle us with your knowledge of psychology.
Well, I just had to analyze myself, over this line. No, really, okay. I would say that, John, I've let go of a lot of perfectionist tendencies I've had over the years, but, it's a struggle for a lot of people. And so I think one of the things is just, before we get into the whole subject, is like, hey, where is this coming from? Why do some of us, and sometimes really struggle with this concept of perfectionism? And some people might even say it's not even a struggle. It's, hey, this is important. Really make sure we get things right, get it perfect. But from a psychological standpoint, they really look into this, like, what are the main causes of perfectionism? And oftentimes it's rooted in some sort of deep-seated insecurity that's based on a fear of judgment or disapproval from others. And it can be very difficult to deal with. And because of that, you don't want to fail. You're afraid of failing and the judgment that might come from not getting something right. And when we are talking about language learning, you're going to not get things right. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. And so that perfectionism can really be a barrier from us from progressing and achieving our language goals.
While at the same time, there may be stages in your development where you feel like, my tones are good enough, it's good enough, and you get kind of lazy, you get kind of complacent. And those are the times when maybe a little bit of perfectionism may actually help you. So we're going to talk about some specific, core skills and areas of learning Chinese and how these ideas might apply.
That's right, John. And I'm just going to touch on the subject just a little bit more. I think really a lot of this it's about standards, because, perfectionism, you almost have like impossibly high standards. And for some of us, we might have very low standards. So I think today, we're talking about the perfectionism, but it's really going to be about like adjusting those standards, I think, in the right way, maybe in a more realistic way that's going to help you progress.
All right, so let's get into it. So let's look at the 4 key skills first. So we'll start with listening. Okay, so when it comes to listening, if we're thinking about, maybe turning on a Chinese drama or maybe trying to listen to an actual Chinese conversation between 2 people on the street or something like that, it's normal to feel insecure and like you want to work on your Chinese more. You don't want to listen to real Chinese yet until your listening is perfect, but obviously it's never going to be perfect. You're not going to become a native speaker through study. So you just gotta sometimes sample and accept that you're not gonna understand everything you hear.
And I think anyone who's been learning Chinese knows this, right? You've listened to some sort of Chinese and you're like, I did not understand anything. I heard maybe a duh in there, right? But yeah, sometimes we might go into this conversation. It's like, I'm not going to engage in any conversation, or I don't even want to listen to anything unless I can fully understand it. Yeah, well, do the best you can sometimes.
But you might have some materials, some listening materials that is pretty basic. And for that kind of stuff, I think it's actually pretty great to be a little bit perfectionist about listening to it over and over again until you can like hear it in your mind. And being able to do that is going to help you understand it in real life and to also reproduce those same words when you go to speak.
There is some sort of benefit sometimes in being a parrot, especially you hear like a phrase and something that's common. Hey, you just practice it over in your head. I've done this a lot of times, John, especially early on. I remember practicing tones. I remember riding my electric bike down the streets of Shanghai and repeating the street that I lived on because it had like a first and fourth tone, and I had to really practice that pair properly. So, sometimes you just do stuff over and over like that. I know we're talking about listening. I'm getting into speaking here, but hey, there's things like that which definitely can help.
All right, well, let's get into speaking because it's kind of similar to listening in that you're not going to be ready for your first unscripted conversation. You can't be, right? There's going to be things that happen that you don't expect. You're not going to understand some things. You're going to want to express something and not be sure how. But you got to just jump into it at some point and start practicing it, right? So you can't be a perfectionist about your speaking ability because you can't control what the other person's saying. And that's why a conversation is interesting.
It's something I've thought about this, John, as we're talking about speaking. Oftentimes, we'd like to go into that conversation fully prepared and be able to understand everything that they're saying and give all of the appropriate responses, that reflect our desires and what we're trying to accomplish. But think about this for a second. If you are a low-level, maybe intermediate learner in Chinese, and for whatever reason, you go in that conversation and you do understand everything that's going on, and you're able to reply appropriately, and you're sounding like a native, well, usually what happens is that conversation is going to continue to progress into a level that's going to exceed your level. And so think about it like this. If you were to encounter somebody and, a kid, and they were just speaking like a little toddler, well, you're going to adjust your speech for that person. But if for whatever reason, this kid seems to be very intelligent and they seem to be speaking very eloquently, you oftentimes are going to come back and match that as well. So sometimes bringing your imperfections and your not good speaking into the conversation actually gives a signal to that other person about how to adjust their language level so that they can appropriately communicate with you.
Right. So don't let those perfectionist tendencies stop you from having conversations. However, similar to listening, there is stuff you can do on your own. You can try to get better at saying certain things. If you're Jared and you love to tell people about the street you live on, then make sure you can say that so you can be a little perfectionist in your preparation for your next conversation.
Definitely. Get some of those set phrases down, some they can roll off your tongue. And there's a lot of opportunities for practice in there, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of good.
Okay, now for reading, I think our listeners should probably know where we stand on reading. Do you think they know, Jared?
I think so. I think they should. Where do you stand, John?
Well, when it comes to reading, there is such a thing as choosing materials that are appropriate to your level, but you can't expect to know every single word. And it's okay to read something where you don't understand a little bit and try to get it from context and to keep going. That's what extensive reading is all about, to be able to read something that is at your level. And a few parts that are a little bit difficult, you can kind of get the gist of and keep going.
Yes, and so I think there's a few nuances in this as well, because reading, this is what one of the big things we're all about here. But for some people who might be perfectionists, they might pick up a text that is too difficult for them, and they feel like I have got to go, grind through this, look up every single character, and you can't fail, right? Setting that book down and trying to go for something easier, it's like admitting defeat. It's like waving a white flag or something. So don't get stuck in that. Feel it's okay to have got a book, even if you bought that book and it's too hard for you. It's okay to set that down and instead look for something that's going to be easier for you at your level. There are a lot of people and stories that I've heard over the years, people who might get stuck on this. They'll say, I've got to get through this book. But it becomes drudgery. We talk about 3 different levels of reading. One of them is reading pain, and it's called reading pain for a reason. It's painful.
Yeah, and it kills your motivation.
It totally kills your motivation. And you hear stories of people who, ground grinded through that book and went all the way through and looked up all the characters. Oh, and this is how I learned Chinese. But what I've been convinced of is that for every one person who's done it like that, there's have to have been hundreds that gave up. And so it is not the most. Can you learn this way? You can. But it is not the most effective way to learn the language, or frankly, any language, doing it like that. There's just better ways.
So if you're going to be a perfectionist about reading, be a perfectionist about finding the right level for you. Like really focus on that, because that's really going to pay off.
That's right. And you're not always going to find something that's right at your level. There's always going to be that stretch. The ideal reading level is going to be like 98% comprehension, but that's not possible all the time. But hey, do the best you can. And especially when you're at the lower levels, getting as close to your level as possible is more important.
All right, so now the fourth main skill is writing. And there's kind of two elements here, because there's handwriting and then there's typing using the written form as communication. So we've mentioned before, we've talked about handwriting and how important it is before. And both Jared and I feel that, being perfectionist over writing characters is probably not the best use of your time unless you're in love with Chinese calligraphy, and then that's a different story.
That's right. So handwriting, yeah, just remember, it is a separate skill in and of itself. So you can learn to read and you cannot learn to handwrite, okay? There are some things in handwriting that will help you, sometimes with improving your character recognition and maybe comprehending them a little bit better, but it is not an essential skill to learn. I think that's one of the key things. We do recommend learning how to do it, but trying to really perfect your handwriting and your characters and everything like that, it takes, John, how many hours? Okay, because you did have to learn to handwrite for your master's program, right?
Yeah, I had to learn to handwrite quickly and accurately in order to pass the written exams to get into the master's program. So I had two essays I had to write entirely in Chinese, about an hour each, and I had to be able to write quite a bit during that time. So I definitely had to get to a decent level.
So give us a little bit of anecdotal, all right, your one data point, but how many hours do you think you spent just learning and improving your handwriting?
All right, so here's the thing. I focused on being able to write the characters, but fortunately I was never too focused on making them beautiful. Because even though I would love to have beautiful Chinese handwriting, I just recognized that it would be too much of a time investment, and I just couldn't bear to do it because, I had a job, I had a girlfriend, I had stuff I wanted to do, and being able to just remember all the strokes and all the characters and all the words and all the sentence structures was enough of a load.
So how much time do you think, though, it even took you to get to where you were? Let's just say, all right, I know how to write all this stuff, and maybe it looks a little bit like chicken scratch, but I'm able to properly write 3,000 characters by hand.
I don't have that number.
Too long. Let's put it that way. Too long. Thousands of hours, I'm assuming, because I know you don't know. I know, but the point is that I think it takes an exceedingly great amount of time and effort into just learning to handwrite, and so it's and being a perfectionist in that area, it can provide a lot more challenges. I recall also I have a friend in Shanghai, and his son was in a it's kind of like I think a dual language kind of immersion school there, and he would get. Now his son was a little bit on the autistic spectrum, and so he got really obsessive about being able to write that character perfectly, having the stroke and all fit right in the box and everything, and it created huge problems for him. He was had a really difficult time in school because of that, and now it's a little bit more of an extreme case, and I don't think a lot of people here listening are required to be able to write that much, but when we get so stuck on having that just perfect and just right, it's really going to slow us down and impede our learning.
Oh, and I do want to say that I would not have spent so much time practicing writing if I didn't have to do it as an entrance exam for my master's program. I'm pretty practical when it comes to my studies. And so, yeah, it's good to be able to write Chinese. Most of us spend quite a bit of time in first, second year Chinese. But there comes a time when there's probably other aspects of the language that are more worth your time.
And I always bring this question up, John. When's the last time you really needed to handwrite Chinese? Well, curse is on you. You're supposed to be like 5 years ago, right? But
Just the other day, some Chinese person made me fill out some random form and like acted like I was just any Chinese person. Just fill out this form and had had no response when I could do it. Like they weren't surprised. They're just like, okay, good. It's just so weird.
that's a good example because like every time I actually have to write in Chinese, it's filling out some form. And that's it. Like otherwise it's like you don't really need to handwrite Chinese.
Okay, but Jared, it's not all about handwriting. So the other thing about writing is like typing and then putting your text out there somewhere. So like I actually went through this quite a bit myself. There was a time many years ago when I would write in Chinese on my blog, and then Chinese people would, leave comments, and I would have communication through my blog, through my Chinese writing. And nowadays it's probably much more common to maybe write something on WeChat in your moments, and then you write it in Chinese and Chinese friends can comment. But I know that there are people that they don't want to write anything because they're afraid, like, what if it's wrong? What if I forget to put le? What if I use the wrong word? And that kind of perfectionist really is hurting you because you're not getting the practice actually communicating that you could be getting.
Absolutely. And with one of my other businesses, I work on sourcing and help people work with factories in China to get what they, get things made and produced and bought. And, if I go in there and sometimes I'd still make mistakes, and I have a tutor, and what I'll do is I'll take some of these chat transcripts of things where I was a little unclear. I'm like, I'm not so sure I said this right. And we analyze it, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, you had a mistake here. You should say it like this, or that's not quite the right usage of that word. This would be better. And it's really helpful. But you know what? I have something to learn from, and if I didn't go out there and just try to communicate, then yeah, nothing's going to get done. Nothing's going to get done at all.
Nice. And that's an all-set learning tutor, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Hola.
Awesome.
She's fantastic.
Okay, so those are the 4 skills, but we actually have a few other things to talk about. And that's like the various aspects of the Chinese language. So, for example, vocabulary and characters being one of them. And I feel like vocabulary and characters, they can both relate to this whole perfectionist tendency in the sense that some people want to like collect them all by putting them all in flashcards and then reviewing the flashcards endlessly.
It's like Pokemon. Got to collect them all.
Right. But instead of like actually speaking, like working on communication, they spend a lot of time reviewing flashcards. So that's a case where a perfectionist tendency, wanting to have perfect recall of everything you've ever studied, is actually going to hamper your development overall in the language.
Yeah, this is a common trap of I talk about this knowledge versus proficiency. It's just like, I just need to acquire more vocabulary. And yes, but if you don't know how to use that vocabulary, it's not going to help you a whole lot. So you need to make sure that obviously it's being practiced and everything. So, and oftentimes, I think sometimes when they get stuck in this trap of just reviewing flashcards, trying to acquire more vocabulary before they're getting out there and speaking, I mean, it's procrastination. And you're procrastinating because you don't want to get out there and make mistakes. You got an excuse. Oh, I'm not ready because I got to learn a little bit more. It's like one of those things when you got like an essay to finish for school the next day, and it's super long, and you haven't even started. So what do? You clean your room, right? You're doing whatever you can to avoid actually doing the task that you need to do.
Right. So this is directly related to the point about speaking that we made in the very beginning.
Yes.
Okay. So now let's go on to pronunciation. Because pronunciation, we all know Chinese pronunciation is hard, and yet still sometimes people get complacent in their pronunciation. They say things like, oh, if you speak fast enough, tones don't matter. Okay? So I feel like if there's any place where a little bit of perfectionist tendencies are justified, it's in pronunciation, because you want to have good, consonants and vowels, the pinyin, core sounds. You want to know that, and then you want to get your tones down because you want people to understand you.
Absolutely. And I think, John, from a linguistics aspect here, when we talk about pronunciation, does that also include tones? Because I always feel like there's a little bit of a separation there. There's the pronunciation, being able to actually say the sounds properly, and then being able to then also produce the right tone.
Yeah, tones are an aspect of the pronunciation. It is a little awkward because when you want to talk about like the consonant and vowel sounds, but not the tones, it's not so easy to specify that.
Gotcha. But this is one of the things if it's very simple, beginner conversations, tones aren't going to be that important because people are going to have a pretty good idea of what you're trying to say. They're not expecting you to go talk about, the impacts of nuclear disarmament on, international relations. So you're just talking about where's the bathroom. So they're expecting that type of a thing. But when you get more advanced in your conversation, tones become more and more important. And if you really plan and hope to progress to any higher levels in Chinese, make sure you get some of those pronunciation and tone aspects down.
Yeah, and this relates to one of the comments you were making earlier, Jared, about how, the better you speak, the more advanced, vocabulary and grammar people start using with you. If your Chinese sounds good, even at a basic level, people want to talk to you more. And because they want to talk to you, they are going to start going into more advanced topics. But even though that's scary, that's actually good for your Chinese. And so the earlier your pronunciation is better, the more helpful it is to your overall progress.
And I remember a piece of advice that someone had given to me a long time ago. They say, he's like, shoot for 100% accuracy on your tones. Because if you're shooting for that, then you'll probably get 80% right. And that's good enough. So it's the chances of you having all your tones perfect and right all the time are not good. And John, you've been living in China for roughly 20 plus years now. You're speaking Chinese almost every day. Do you still make tone mistakes?
I do, but I'll tell you, Jared, I'm a lot better than 80%.
I believe it.
But I am shooting for 100%. Yes, shooting for 100%.
Shooting for 100%. But I think that's a good point, John. It's like, hey, even if you're I'm going to guess you're probably 98, 99%, maybe 99.5, whatever. But the point is you still make some mistakes. And that's okay. And
I still have to live with myself.
Yeah, there you go. Embrace that imperfection.
Okay, so the final thing that we're going to mention is grammar. And, I'm into grammar, Chinese Grammar Wiki. And that doesn't mean that I think grammar should be the central pillar of everyone's studies, then they must master grammar before opening their mouths or anything like that. I understand that, especially in the beginning, you probably don't have to hit the grammar too hard.
Some people say Chinese has no grammar. That's not true.
Not true.
It does. It has relatively simple grammar, and especially if you're comparing it to Danish or Slavic languages. Oh, yes, it's very simple. But don't get so hung up on grammar issues because really people, as long as you're getting enough things right in other areas and you're still screwing up your grammar, people are still going to understand you. And grammar's patterns. And so you're only really going to pick up those patterns after you start to really encounter the language where there's, listening, reading, and you're trying to reproduce that in speaking and writing. So it's really important to get those things going to really get those grammar patterns imprinted in your brain.
Yeah, my advice about grammar would be that you don't need to be perfectionist about grammar in the beginning. Most people find the patterns fairly straightforward to pick up and apply. But once you've been studying for long enough, there are certain aspects of grammar that will just keep tripping you up again and again. And you'll realize it's like, man, there's something about this that I'm just not getting. And then eventually it's going to bother you enough that you're going to look it up. Please come to the Chinese Grammar Wiki, right? You'll look it up and you'll be like, oh, that's how you're supposed to do it. This is the part I wasn't getting. And because you were ready to learn it and you knew that you needed it, the time has come for you to be a little bit more perfectionist about that particular thing. And I find that's a very healthy way to approach it. When the time comes, you will feel the necessity and you will master it.
And that leads to, I think, the overall advice that I give, and I think, John, you're in line with this as well, is that we don't recommend sitting down and studying grammar. Start trying to build more familiarity with the language, and then as things are, you get some confusion or you're unsure about how something might work or if you're doing it right, look it up. Use grammar more as a reference as opposed to something studied. Because grammar rules are kind of abstract and you really need context to really grasp them. So you need to have enough repetition and context to really comprehend that and use it properly. And have clarification, just as you're saying there, John.
Yeah, so study when you need it, use it as a reference, clear up the confusion when you need it.
So we've talked a lot of things about perfectionism, and really standards as well that you might have for yourself. And I think, to kind of wrap this up, John, something that kind of came to mind is this book by Brene Brown. It's called The Gifts of Imperfection. It's a great book. Recommend it to anyone, especially anyone who's dealing with perfectionism or a recovering perfectionist. But one of the core tenets of what she's trying to say here in this book is that it's trying to teach us not to change ourselves or try to adapt to other people's expectations, but instead we need to embrace and engage with our own imperfections. And the great thing about doing this in language learning is that as we really learn to embrace, hey, I'm not a native speaker. My Chinese is buhao, right? That allows us really to take further steps in progressing and in growing. We're going to be more willing to take risks. We're willing to fail, and we're willing to not be perfect. And in doing so, that helps us to, in some kind of, and that helps us in some way to actually begin to approach a little closer to actual perfection. We're not going to get to perfection, but, it's going to improve. We're going to get better.
I hear what you're saying, but in studying Chinese, in going from knowing nothing about Chinese to becoming, more and more fluent, you are changing yourself. You're changing yourself from, a monolingual into a bilingual or bilingual into a trilingual. And that's pretty cool. But yeah, there's always going to be that element of imperfection for sure.
It is pretty cool because you know what? You can learn Chinese. All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. And today our sponsor is
Mandarin Companion, easy-to-read Chinese novels, otherwise known as Chinese Graded Readers. And actually, guys, we have a newsletter.
That's right. We have a newsletter that gets sent out periodically. And if you want to join our newsletter, all you need to do is go to our website, mandarincompanion.com.
We're working on a new book. We're going to tell you more about it in a future episode. But if you want to be the first one to hear about new books coming out, you got to sign up for the newsletter. We'll mention it on the podcast, but, it could be a week or two late. You want to be up to date, so please sign up for the newsletter, and we'll let you know what's going on.
So go out there right now, today, tomorrow, not tomorrow, now. Don't procrastinate this one. MandarinCompanion.com. Check out our website. You can also find links to a whole bunch of stuff. We have a lot of resources. Oh, and that level test, John. We should plug that. If you're not sure about what level of book is right for you, scroll down on the page a little bit. Which says we have to take the test. It's a little level test to help you find out what's the right level for you.
I have a feeling that will also be mentioned in a future newsletter.
All right, now it's time for rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
I have a bit of a rant. It's kind of a lame rant, but whatever. So I like Beijing. I haven't been there in a long time, COVID and all that. And I was talking to my friend in Beijing. He was my classmate when I was doing my master's in applied linguistics here in China, and he lives in Beijing now. And I was telling him, man, I want to come visit you with my family. My kids haven't even seen the Great Wall yet. And he's like, oh, it's a good thing you didn't try to come this summer. He's like, the crowds in Beijing this summer are insane. And I think it's because of COVID, and people haven't been traveling for so long. And, most people, when they travel domestically. And for most people in China, what's the single, most interesting destination? It's the capital, Beijing. And so Beijing has just been mobbed by crowds this summer. And I'm not actually interested in going to Beijing in the summer because it's so hot. Like being out on the Great Wall under the glaring summer sun is pretty bad.
Yeah.
But he was saying, do not try to come to Beijing for the October holiday because it's still going to be insane. And I don't want to go in the winter. And I'm just thinking, man, when am I going to get to Beijing? Like, I kind of need to go on a holiday, but the crowds are just so insane. So I guess my rant is that there are a lot of people in China. I don't know. I'd like to see Beijing, but I'll let the rest of the country do it first, I guess. Eventually, maybe the crowds will die down a little bit, or I'll get a break in my schedule where I can get up not during a holiday. I don't know. We'll see.
Where are you going to go instead?
Where am I going to go instead? I don't know. That's a question for another time, man.
Go North Korea.
Japan would be good. Also quite mobbed with Chinese tourists, though.
Well, we're still waiting for those mobs over here in the U.S.
Would be nice if all those flights resumed. Okay, anyway, Jared, your turn. Rant or rave today?
John, I've got a rave. Now, I came across an article recently. It's called The Physics of Languages. And I just thought this was really interesting. It's from physicsworld.com. But it was interesting. There was these linguists, physicists, guys. I don't know if they kind of created this discipline, but it's applying physics models, mathematical models, to analyzing languages. So it's like analyzing like how they spread and how things within a language spread, and also like analyzing different elements or features that are common between languages. So I thought it was a really interesting article. Just a couple points behind it, which I thought people might find interesting, is they even like within Japan, they use some of these physics models, because like, one of the things like in your physics, they can, model out like how particles will diffuse through a solution, or sound waves will go out. And they're finding out like how one study they did was like how curse words in Japan, how they kind of radiated it out from Kyoto out through the rest of the country, and they're tracking like the progression, how they became adopted. It was interesting things. Also forensically showing how like some Native American languages started in certain areas and how they spread out in different areas. They also did this in Mexico. And John, they cited this statistical law, so to speak, that they've found using this method. It's called Zipf's law of brevity. And pretty much what it does, it states that more frequently used words tend to be shorter. And they did this study among like over 1,000 languages, and it's shown to be hold up true from 100,000 languages from 80 different linguistic families. So it's pretty much saying that like most commonly things that you need to say in a language are short, and they kind of tend to be short.
So in Chinese, you mean one character?
Well, John, I'm not entirely sure exactly how that applies to Chinese, but I guess maybe less commonly used things have more characters in them, maybe. But evidently, this law applies to. It's been held up in over 1,000 different languages. I'm going to assume Chinese is in there.
Are you familiar with Zipf's law in general?
No, I'm not. Are you?
Yeah, it's pretty famous in linguistics.
Enlighten me, John.
Well, it's usually applied to like computational linguistics and word frequency. And so according to Zipf's law, the most common word in a language, has a certain percentage in a corpus. And then the second most common will have half of that, frequency. And then the third most common will have half. And it always follows this distribution, as long as it's a significantly, large text. And the same thing is true not only for words, but also for letters in the English language. And I think even the same thing is true for maybe music or something like that. I don't know. It is crazy. If you, it's ZIPF, right? Zipf's law. If you look it up on Wikipedia or wherever, it's really interesting because, languages are not totally natural. They come from humans, so we don't think of them as being like, sound waves or whatever. But they follow these rules. It's really cool.
Fascinating. Well, we'll put a link in the show notes to this if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the physics of languages. It's a really interesting read, and you can go get into it. So, John, I assume you're going to pick up physics now.
I'm not, Jared. I'll let you be the physics guy in this duo, all right?
My name's Rob Neal. I'm from Manchester, England. I'm a Mandarin Chinese teacher at the secondary school level, so that's for students from 11 to 16. I'm the Manchester Swire Chinese Language Centre Coordinator, and I'm based at the Manchester Grammar School.
If Rob sounds familiar, that's because he had a brief appearance 2 episodes ago on Unleashing the Power of Motivation at the Swire Chinese Language Conference, where he gave an introduction prior to my presentation. Rob and I recently sat down to talk about his Chinese journey, one that is filled with the twists and turns of life. Stay with us. All right, Rob. Hey, this is great to have you on the show. We had you briefly on the previous episode for the Swire conference where I was there, and we got to work on some few things. So, but begging the big question, we're going to start out here is, why did you start learning Chinese?
Well, that's a very good question. So when I was at school, sort of 1988 to 1995, secondary school, we didn't have the option to learn Mandarin Chinese. I love languages, so I did French and German. I even did Latin up to the age of 16. And I sort of realised that I'd led quite a Eurocentric life. My parents had got me interested in China. They'd been to China. They had lots of Chinese friends in Manchester. So I thought about perhaps after doing French and German, maybe going to China, teaching English for a couple of years, checking it out. But actually there were no programs, no schemes that really grabbed me. So I ended up in Japan for 2 years on the JET program.
Well, Robert, I want to hear about something first. This sounds really interesting about your upbringing.
Yeah.
Okay. You turned this a Eurocentric life, right? At what age did you feel like you realized that? And I'm also curious to know about your parents. I mean,
Yeah.
This was in the 80s, right? The 80s, 90s. And why did they go to China? Not a lot of people were going to China.
Yeah, well, they were invited in 1994 by the Chinese government. Ultimately, it was called the Chinese Association for International Understanding or something like that. And they're teachers. So they went with a group of other educators and visited Beijing, a few other places, and Wuhan, which is the sister city of Manchester. And I think out of that trip, they led quite a pioneering trip at the time for school children from Manchester to Wuhan. And it was a return trip as well. So sort of 1997, 1998, something like that. Suddenly we had lots of Chinese students in Manchester coming from Wuhan. So that made quite a deep impression on me. And I met them. And I think it was at that stage when I was doing French and German at university, that sort of, hang on, there's a big world out there.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. So what kind of teachers were they? And did you say they took a group of students to Wuhan?
Yeah, they took a group of students from 2 schools in Manchester. So I think quite pioneering at the time. And the Chinese consul general, who was based in Manchester, I think he was quite keen that the students from Manchester visited his old school where he was a child in Wuhan. So that's how that particular link worked. You know, there's a huge Chinese community in Manchester as well. And my dad did some volunteering teaching English with a Manchester Chinese church. And through that, I met lots of interesting Chinese visiting scholars that wanted to practice their English, and I'd try and practice my Chinese. So it must have been through my parents that initial passion and interest for China came. But university, did French and German, loved it. And actually I was on a year abroad in the south of France, Montpellier, and I took some Chinese lessons for about 6 weeks. So that was my first actual experience of learning Chinese. It was a disaster. I was lost. It was a huge class. The teacher was very strict, so lots of characters, and I gave up after about 6 weeks, thought this isn't for me.
You said a disaster of a class. I mean, and you gave up, but obviously something kept you going or picked it back up again. What was that?
Well, then I was back in the University of Birmingham, my final year, wondering what to do after graduation, not ready for a proper job, hoping to go to China. I still had this passion, investigated some of the programs for teaching English. Nothing really grabbed me. It seemed there was nothing that well organised. So I ended up in Japan on the JET program.
Tell us about that. What is this Japan JET program?
I think it's called Japan English Teaching. I need to check it out. But it's been going since the 1980s. Basically, they send over native speakers, mainly from all over, but Canada, Australia, England, the US, to improve the spoken English of Japanese school children. So I was an ALT, an assistant language teacher, and I worked in the classroom with, they call it the JTE, the Japanese Teacher of English. So I was in a high school, sort of 15 to 18-year-olds for 2 years. Loved it. It was a fantastic experience. And when I was in Japan, I visited China on my own for about 4 days.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was an adventure because, I arrived late at night in Beijing, couldn't speak a word of Chinese.
And I know the airport in Beijing is very far outside of the city.
That's right. And it was 2002, so it was over 20 years ago. But yeah, loved it. Just explored Beijing, got lost, had lots of adventures just for 4 days, but it really whetted the appetite. And when I got back from Japan, I thought, you know what, I do want to check this out properly. I'm a bit older, a bit wiser now. So I did a master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages, so quite a lot of applied linguistics.
Mm-hmm.
Sent off my CV, my curriculum vitae to lots of universities. And the only person that bothered to get back to me and offered me a job was Beida, like Beijing University.
Oh, well, that's a good one to get back to.
Yeah, it was exactly. I was very lucky, very fortunate. Went out, so this was 2004 to 2006. Didn't really know what I was doing, but it was a wonderful experience, and I fell in love with China and the people there.
Well, I want to know some more details of this because you just told me how you spent 2 years in Japan.
Yeah.
And then you just had a little jaunt across the strait there, if you will, to China. And now you're in China and you're having a great experience there. What was the difference then? I mean, why are you not a Japanese teacher now? What was about Chinese and then you said really to go for that as opposed to something else?
I think my original passion was for China, not Japan. I loved my time in Japan. It sounds a bit patronizing, but it was a really gentle, easy introduction to Asia because the program was so good. So I had lots of support, lots of conferences with other teachers and a lovely school. But perhaps I felt it was maybe already a developed country. It wasn't changing that fast. I traveled quite a lot. When I was in Japan, I went to Southeast Asia as well. And I got a real buzz. When I was in China, it was just changing so fast. It was crazy. And I thought maybe, again, 2 years in Japan, I'd sort of seen quite a lot and obviously didn't understand that much, but felt quite, okay, I've sort of seen Japan now. I went to China and I thought, well, it's changing too fast. If I stay here for 2 years, it'll be completely different. Whereas if I stay for 2 years longer in Japan, the change wouldn't have been that major. Am I making sense, Jared?
Yeah.
So it was more exciting in a way, personally. And it was sort of more rough and ready around the edges. I don't want to get into lazy stereotypes, but I did get a huge buzz out of my sort of 4 or 5 days in China. And I knew that I'd be back. And I was.
Wow, that's neat. Rob, I'm still curious about something, though. You've mentioned this, so just a little bit, that affinity, just that interest you've had in China. You talked about your parents. When you were younger, they traveled to China. Were there any specific experiences or stories or something that just really captivated your attention, or something over the years that hey, they experienced that, that's something you wanted to have for yourself?
Well, they did tell me lots of stories and they showed lots of photos, but I think it's one thing hearing it from other people, it's another thing going for yourself. It sounds like an empty cliche, but it was very different from anything I'd experienced before, and it just felt very different from, spending time in France and Germany, which I'd done, obviously, as part of my university degree. I'd also taught English in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, before going to university, so I'd travelled quite a lot in Eastern Europe. But China just seemed to think, wow, I need to spend time getting to grips with this place, getting my head around it, learning the language. That first initial trip, I was just a complete tourist. I was staying in some hostel downtown, off to the Great Wall, watching an acrobat show, walking around, getting lost. But I can't quite put my finger on it, but it just was it was a wonderful time, and it made a deep impression on me, Jared.
Yeah, I can understand that. Well, tell us a little bit now. So you were at Beida, and for listeners who may not be familiar with that, it's Beijing University. That's one of the top universities there in China. So what was your Chinese like at this point? And how were you learning through this process?
So when I went to Japan, I was probably a bit tired because I'd just finished my first degree, French and German finals, and I probably wasn't as hard-working as I could have been with the Japanese, although I did pick up some because I was there for 2 years. But from day one in China, I was keen. I was going to make a huge effort. I did about 3 months before I came over. I learned some sentences off by heart. I think I had a textbook. It was something like 301, a sort of conversational Chinese. So I basically learned these sentences almost as prefabricated chunks, just everyday life. But I listened to it on the CDs. It might even have been taped in those days. I can't remember. But that helps because it gave me confidence to, I could survive and had a fairly decent accent. I mean, I couldn't read or write, but people understood what I was trying to say, which gave me a lot of confidence. And it was just things like getting that on the bus and saying to the person next to me, please tell me when we get to Beijing Normal University because I want to get off. So I'd learn that like a parrot, that phrase, and then they would tell me, or the whole bus would tell me,
Hey, you, get off the bus.
Exactly. And the driver would shout at me. And I was, so like little things, I was out of my comfort zone, but you couldn't do anything without necessarily becoming the center of attention, but you just had to force yourself into those and just get on with it. But in terms of my Chinese, it was an amazing experience because it was complete immersion. So I was teaching 12 hours a week at Beida, so 4 hours, 8 till 12, 3 days a week. But the rest of the time I was free. So I did try and join a language course there. One teacher was very nice and let me join her class. Other teachers were more strict and thinking, who are you? You're a teacher. You're not allowed to join us.
Oh, really?
But I ended up at a local language school in Wudalco just down the road, and it was about 12 yuan an hour. My classmates were from Korea, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Japan, a few Americans, a few Russians, not many Brits, but it was great. So I was speaking with my Japanese classmates and Korean classmates in Chinese. Chinese was the language we had in common, which again gave me a lot of confidence just to make the most of it. And I could practice on the streets in real life. It was complete immersion. So I think my spoken Chinese and listening developed quite quickly. It had to. In those days, I could afford to get a taxi, but the taxi driver would ask me how old I am, how much money I earn, was I married, did I have children, that sort of thing.
the common questions.
Absolutely. But, it just gives you confidence. And then from there, you don't mind making mistakes so much because you've already established initial rapport with the person you're speaking to. And equally, I could sit at Beida, sit by the lake and write out my characters and pretend I was Russian when someone wanted to practice English with me.
That's a classic trick.
Yeah, absolutely.
No speak English. Right?
Or I could pretend I was French or German, but because they're so clever, they could speak French and German too, but never mind.
So it sounds like there was a lot of progress for you during this time. You're really immersed in the language. Can you think of any real breakthrough moments, like some experiences or something where it's like, wow, this is really starting to click in my head?
When family members came out to visit, they relied on me. And my brother would be thinking, oh my goodness, my little brother's chatting to a Beijing taxi driver and surviving. And that would give me a lot of confidence. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite as good as I thought. So, for example, when my parents came, we booked a weekend in Shanghai to visit some of their friends. And I got the taxi to the wrong station.
Oh, no.
The taxi driver realised halfway through and got us to a subway, and we got to the right station just in time. But I think my dad thought, hang on a bit. His Chinese is not quite as good, a long way to go. But I think things like this, gave me confidence when friends from England or family members could see me in a new context, using Chinese, being understood, surviving.
I always found out that little do they know, you're out there, someone's talking to you in Chinese and you're like, 听不懂,
Absolutely.
不知道, or something like that. You're just saying like, I don't know, I don't understand. And people are like, wow, your Chinese is so good.
And sometimes I'd actually say that. To the person I was talking to be honest, they think my Chinese is great, but I can't actually say much at all. But anyway, we had a laugh. And those 2 years or 2.5 years were a real sort of explosion in terms of my own Chinese, definitely.
Now, how long were you there in Beijing?
Well, it's 2004 to the middle of 2006, June 2006.
So you made that transition then. You came back home to Manchester, I presume. What did you do then?
Well, actually, I went to Sheffield, which is near Manchester. I did this thing called a PGCE teacher training course because I thought, I love teaching, and that experience in China and Japan had made me realise that this is what I wanted to do as a career. So I trained, and Sheffield at that time was one of the only places in the UK that offered a teacher training course in Chinese as well as French and German. So that's why I chose there, and trained to be a secondary school teacher in languages, but with a particular focus on French, German and Chinese.
You decide, hey, I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to do this. Well, tell me a little bit. This was, I guess, the middle of the 2000s, right?
Yeah.
You're making that jump into this area. And now, I guess you've been in roughly 15 years or so. So, things change and evolve over the time. And what's also kind of kept you interested in really saying, hey, I really enjoy this?
I'm passionate about languages. And I want to share that passion with the young people. And Chinese, and having decent Chinese, has opened doors. So it's got me my first job at a school in Sheffield. What I really enjoyed, apart from just teaching, are the trips to China. So I've led 7 trips of school children over to China. I mean, it sounds good, but actually most of it were summer camps to sort of Hanban organised Xiaolingyi. So it's quite easy to, it's just as long as you get the kids to the airport, sort out their visas, once you get to China, most things are taken care of. But it was a real buzz for me when you take a young lad from Sheffield or Manchester to China. You go to Shanghai at night, you see the skyscrapers lit up and the sort of the wow factor. And it's transformative for some of these kids who come back really motivated, and they make friends with Chinese people. And I'm a great believer in sort of face-to-face interaction and just making Chinese not this dry, academic, boring subject, but bring it alive in really meaningful ways.
Well, Rob, I'm interested to hear you say this really transforms some of your students' whole motivation or perception or everything around Chinese.
Absolutely.
Do you have any experiences or something you could share with any of your students who really had that transformational experience?
Well, I think 4 or 5 have gone on to study it at university. That's great, because I see my job as planting seeds. So hopefully you can reach some level of proficiency on 2 hours a week over 5 years. But obviously to get to the next stage, you need to take it seriously and do it at university or A-level, or perhaps live there as part of your university course. So it's great that some students have gone on to do that. I like to tell stories. So I'd been teaching for a year, so 2007, and I managed to get a job back in Beijing for the Olympics 2008 with the BBC as a local fixer, which was fantastic. I had an interview. I basically told them I've lived in Beijing for 2.5 years. I know the city well. I speak Chinese. You're going to have lots of journalists. I think you need my help. Can I have a job, please? So I was quite cheeky, but, if you don't ask, you don't get. And it was a wonderful sort of to see China's coming out party, but it was China proud to the rest of the world. And there was a real sense of excitement about the future. All these thousands of volunteers, Chinese university students helping out. Even the most cynical BBC journalist had their heart melted by some of these lovely people. But for me, I think it was, again, really motivating for my students. I sort of come back and tell them stories about living in China, working for the BBC during the Olympics. And they thought, hopefully, well, if he can do that, I can do that. And I want to carry on with my Chinese. So I think, again, as a Chinese teacher, you've got to not just teach the language, but teach these stories, teach these experiences, share them with our children, our students, and motivate them.
I'm really interested to hear about this story of you working for the BBC during the Olympics in Beijing. I mean, that sounds great. And I've got to say, from my knowledge, of living in China and how many people have tried to help out, get settled in and deal with all the issues, I can only imagine they didn't know they needed someone like you, right?
Well, it was great because they gave my mobile number out to all the journalists on the radio, and I had a few calls late at night, please help me get home to my hotel. So I'd have to chat to the taxi driver and give sort of directions or give the name of the hotel in Chinese, that sort of thing. I did take some of them shopping. In those days, it was a lot easier to go to some markets and get some interesting goods and presents for people back home.
The infamous silk market back there, right?
Exactly, that sort of thing. Or just take them to interesting places and interesting bars and restaurants. So for me, that was one side of it. I mean, it was a test of my Chinese because I remember one journalist, she said that she needed a massage and she needed to have her nails done. So I had to phone around and basically, I know the word for massage and more, but I'm not too sure about, my Chinese was extended, but I ended up phoning up a 5-star hotel and speaking in English, but I sorted out a nice massage for her. Another time where I really was testing with my Chinese, because I would have got into serious trouble if I'd made a mistake, was I think they did the question, the sort of horse jumping in Hong Kong.
Oh, yeah.
So I had to book a ticket for the one correspondent from Beijing to Hong Kong. And I had his passport number. And obviously, you can make certain grammatical errors, but if you mess up the passport number, he's going to miss his flight. Anyway, I didn't. That's fine. But it just shows in terms of some mistakes are worse than others. But as long as you get your message, you work out what time it is, you make sure his name is spelled just as it is on the passport, you give his passport number, he gets his plane. I wasn't sacked, although I wasn't invited back for the Winter Olympics, but maybe that was COVID. It was a bit harder.
Yeah, that's a little different. You're on to other things by then.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. But no, it was a wonderful experience. And actually, I've got a few of my BEDAR students on the radio being interviewed, which was really nice to add a bit of local colour to the programs and give a sort of a sense of real life.
No, that's really neat. That's really neat. Well, I want to know a little bit more, Rob. I mentioned earlier, what are some things you've really seen in language education, but also where do you see the future of Chinese language education going?
Yeah, I mean, we're having a bit of a hiccup at the moment, to be honest. It's been great. There's been massive growth to about 2015, 2016. I think there's some geopolitical issues. I think it's hard to go to China at the moment, even with the end of COVID. So if you're not a fluent speaker or you're not very confident, that's quite tricky, but we'll get through it. And I believe passionately that things go round in circles, they go up and down. And the fact that there's a bit of a hiccup between the West and China in terms of political relations, we need even more people that can speak Chinese, that can understand China properly. So we keep going. But the organisation I'm involved with now, the Swire Chinese Language Foundation, we work with over 140 schools, about 20,000 students who are learning Chinese regularly, that wouldn't be learning Chinese without the funding of the Swire Chinese Language Foundation. So that's encouraging, that's positive. There's other things happening in the UK, and we realise that China matters. You can't live in the 21st century without understanding China, Chinese, how China thinks, because it's not a monolithic thing, but without having a real handle on Chinese culture. It's not just this elitist subject anymore, the sort of top independent private schools. It's very much more mainstream, which is exciting. It's also not just for universities, but actually for schools. But, I think one statistic that really saddens me, and I better get my facts right, but it's something like 300,000 Chinese students are currently studying in America, and there are about 300 Americans studying in China. And it's similar for the UK. In Manchester, we've got 8,000 Chinese students at the University of Manchester, and we've probably got several hundred, maybe 1,000 English people studying Chinese at universities in England. Wow. So there's a huge knowledge imbalance, and I don't want to get into them and us, because I think we are all we, but if I were going to get into that, you'd say the Chinese know an awful lot more about the West than people in the West know about China, and that needs to change.
I remember a statistic that I saw in some emails we had months ago, Robert, when we were planning for that Swire conference, is that you showed me something that illustrated some study that was done by the UK government, and showing that there was due to the lack of Chinese speakers in the UK, there was a measurable impact on the GDP or the growth or something, economic impact on UK.
Well, there must be. I find it a bit annoying when governments and politicians just leap on trade statistics and sort of justify language learning in quite narrow, instrumental economic terms, because for me it's, we all need a job, and that's quite helpful. It's just much more about the people-to-people understanding and the culture and accessing a different part of the world. And actually, China's everywhere, and I don't have to leave my hometown to use Chinese every day. There are Chinese families on the street, which is great, and I can speak to them in Chinese. So it's a crucial language. It's really important, I think, in the sort of current climate of fear and sort of increasing nationalism everywhere. We've just got to get out of our little island mentality and, reach out and, I should get off my high horse soon. But yeah, Chinese is crucial.
I also want to hear a little bit from you outside of the classroom, because you are teaching Chinese in the classroom. And I imagine even the ability of students to actually converse, is limited at times.
Yeah.
How do you use your Chinese in your life? And you mentioned you have neighbors, but maybe you talk a little bit about that.
My wife's Chinese, so
there you go. That's a good start.
We met at the University of Sheffield. I mean, her English is much better than my Chinese, but we do speak Chinese quite a lot at home because, well, for the kids' sake as well, they're 3 and 7, and her parents are currently staying with us, so it's full-on immersion for the next 5 months, which is good for me. So I'm using Chinese every day at the moment. But I suppose outside the classroom as well, I think, I was getting a bit sort of 2014, I've been teaching for 7 years, and I felt a bit like a hamster on a treadmill going round and round, just preparing students for tests and getting me a bit down. I thought there's got to be more to life than this. So I actually applied to do a PhD in instructed second language acquisition, but I was looking particularly at pronunciation. That was great because I got fully funded scholarship.
Wow, that's
great. And it meant I could go down from 5 days a week to 3 days a week and do the PhD and do justice to it, which gave me a new lease of life. And it actually took 7 years. So I finished in 2013 to 2020. But that was obviously using my Chinese. It was very much a sort of case study focusing on my own students and students at another school and looking at their pronunciation and the problems they might have, which I found really interesting and stimulating.
Well, that's really neat. I just remembered something that I did want to ask you about.
Yeah.
You had mentioned when you went to China, you really improved your spoken proficiency.
Yeah.
How did you learn characters along the way? And what are some things that you did and things maybe even in hindsight, hey, that was more helpful, and other things that might have been less effective to help you acquire characters and improve that whole literacy aspect?
I was a bit lazy. I love speaking and listening. I made more of an effort doing that. I did sit down by the lake at Beidar and write out characters. I thought, if this works for Chinese people, this is going to work for me. And I'd just copy out sentences after sentence, dozens of times. But it was quite dull, to be honest. I got several hundred characters that way, but it was a struggle. And what I regret, and I'm not just saying this because it's your podcast, but, I'm a great believer in just enjoying language for its own sake, reading for fun, immersing yourself in the sort of comprehensible input room. So if I'd come across Mandarin Companion earlier and just started reading breakthrough level books for pleasure, that would have helped massively. I only came across them a few years actually during the first lockdown, when I was, just like the rest of the world, basically unable to travel, unable to do much. I was just walking around a local park, pushing a baby around, and I came across your podcast, and that introduced me to Mandarin Companion, and that's really helped actually for me, because I've been much stronger on the speaking and listening side, a lot weaker on the literacy, and just reading for pleasure and realizing actually it's not that painful. It's relatively painless. I mean, I am reading quite quickly, and I'm reading sort of, 450 character books. So I'm a Chinese teacher. I should be able to cope with that. But it was motivating, and just to feel, oh wow, I can actually read a book in Chinese. And funnily enough, I think it was, although I'm speaking a lot of Chinese in my daily life, it can plateau, because even if I make mistakes, my wife knows exactly what I want to say. She doesn't bother correcting me. Fair enough. Sometimes I'm too tired to speak Chinese, so she'll speak in Chinese, I'll speak in English, that sort of thing. But I think reading helps your spoken Chinese as well in a strange way. Maybe it's just your head talking to itself. But that was good, and I'd recommend getting into that earlier.
Oh, I understand. It's a road, but I'm glad to hear that we helped you a little bit in that area. But it's great to hear that, though, Rob, because I would assume that, you're reading or level 2 books. There's not like there's a whole lot of new characters or anything you're encountering at that point. But it's illustrative to really anybody, is that when we started learning Chinese, reading a book in Chinese seemed like an unobtainable goal.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you got to be like near native, but hey, you got something you can read? Bam, there you go.
Yeah, it's quite annoying being corrected by my 7-year-old son now, but
Oh, no.
I'll take it.
Something else I forgot to ask you about is, okay, you did a PhD
Yep.
focusing on Chinese language learning. You obviously had a thesis.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was that? What was your area of research, your thesis? Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, it's quite a controversial area.
Ooh,
I
controversial.
took some students out to Xi'an in, I think, 2012, 2013, and one student said to me, sort of very matter-of-factly, "Sir, I don't really bother with tones because they're going to understand anyway from the context." A little light bulb moment. I thought, okay, that's quite an interesting assumption. I don't agree with you, but I like the fact you've said that to me. Thank you. And actually, that became my PhD thesis, sort of to test the students' assumptions. So I recorded them doing various stuff, sort of speaking single word level, sentence level, speaking spontaneously. I had 40 Chinese postgraduate listeners sort of based in the UK. So their first language was Chinese. They weren't teachers. They didn't know anything about my students. I randomized all the audio samples and got them to write down what they thought the student was trying to say. I also got them to give a mark out of 9 for accent. So 1 being no accent, 9 being very heavy accent, and something called comprehensibility, which means how easy it is to be understood. So 1 for very easy to be understood, 9 for virtually impossible. And what I found were the sort of intelligibility, the accent, the comprehensibility were partially independent dimensions. So what that means is it was quite common to be completely understood, 100% intelligible, easy to be understood, so very high comprehensibility, but also be perceived to have a strong accent. And when I interviewed them about what was causing this strong accent, often, not always, but often it was the tones. So basically, there was evidence to support what my student was saying, and that tones, you could still have fairly dodgy tones and be understood easily. However, it's more complicated than that. Obviously, tones do matter. Obviously, it depends on the nature of the task. So at the individual word level, tones are completely crucial. At the sentence level, less so. But there's also other things going on. But in terms of my students who only had 2 hours a week, very limited exposure to Mandarin outside the classroom, in an ideal world, we focus on everything, but we haven't got time. So I was looking at what was actually causing these breakdowns in intelligibility. And very often, as much as tones, it was equally segmental, so vowels and consonants, initials and finals. And so it was interesting, and it was very practical. But yeah, I'm not arguing that tones don't matter. Of course they do, but people have different needs. And if you're using Chinese professionally, and if you're working in the Beijing in the British Embassy, you don't want to have disastrous tones, or you won't be taken very seriously. You'll sound like a robot, but you might still be understood.
Well, I think that's really interesting to hear that. And I'm going to get your feedback on this, but my impression would be is that things that are more standard, more commonly spoken, and usually I would say most language used by a non-native speaker is going to be a bit more basic, I would say, and a little bit more expected, I think would be one of the words. Was there any measure in your study based on the complexity of the idea or the more or less frequently used words and how the tones affected the intelligibility and understandability of that?
So obviously, if you're using rare vocab and in a topic that people don't know much about, then tones and everything will become more important. But because I was focusing on beginners or people that had just done Chinese for 18 months at the time for recording, inevitably, it was fairly basic. But I suppose what was interesting and perhaps surprising was they were most intelligible in the role play when they're speaking spontaneously without preparing. And when they'd had, the written sentences and I'd given them 15 minutes to prepare, they could practice with thetheir friends. It was written in pinyin and in characters. Actually, they were less intelligible then than when they were just speaking freely, which I was arguing that goes back to perhaps when I was asking them the question, either I hao shi shen ma, I was giving them a sort of model of how to speak, so what I hao shi shen wang, something like that. Or perhaps they weren't speaking spontaneously, really. They were actually speaking in these chunks that they'd learned off by heart, and they were just sort of repeating. And actually, when role plays, they were only saying stuff that they were confident about rather than, they were avoiding difficult sounds. So it might not have quite been as cognitively demanding as purely sort of spontaneous speech, perhaps. But I think it's important to carry out this research, particularly on young school-aged beginner learners, because there's so little out there. Most of the research is in North American universities with adult learners who have chosen to do Chinese as a major. And there's a huge difference between those sorts of people and my students that perhaps they've just, they're 12, 13 years old.
And honestly, I really do agree with that. It's one of these things, though, do tones matter? And it's, the answer is always kind of, it depends, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to learn some phrase book Chinese to get you through, a week in China, your tones are not going to be as critical because you're going to be saying set phrases that people are familiar with, right? But I imagine as your speech and your language gets more advanced and stuff, I guess this is one of my opinions, anecdotal, but the importance of getting your tones right increases.
I agree. And it's equally when you travel in China, again, I don't want to sound really arrogant, but sometimes you go to somewhere like Guizhou or deepest Henan, where my wife's from, and people have very different tones from the standard sort of Putonghua that we learn. And then again, who actually speaks Putonghua? Even Beijing Mandarin, it's sort of based on that maybe, but not really exactly the same. So what is native, standard, perfect Chinese? It doesn't really exist. And just like no one speaks received pronunciation English, or what is that, if I spell it. Anyway, it's a really interesting area, and I'm passionate about it.
Here's a fun anecdotal story. When I'd first just moved to China, I had a roommate. He was Italian. He didn't pick up any Chinese while he was there. And at the time was before all the apps for calling taxis and stuff. And we could pick up the phone and it would call to the guards down at the front of the gate of the apartment complex. And you could ask them to get you a taxi. He would always help us with that. And then one day he's just like, hey, just pick up the phone. And, the word for taxi in Chinese is, 出租车, and just go choo choo choo. Like a train, like choo choo. And he picks up the phone and goes, choo choo choo. And the guy said, Halda or something like that. And then, 2 minutes later, a taxi rolls up.
Brilliant. Well, that's intelligible, but maybe low levels of comprehensibility and very heavy accent. Sorry, I'm being silly.
There you go.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Well, Robert, what advice would you give to someone who's learning Chinese right now?
Keep going, persevere. You'll get there in the end. Don't be scared of making mistakes. Throw yourself in. Have a laugh. Enjoy it. Meet wonderful Chinese people because they bring it alive in a way that the textbook never will. And if at all possible, get out to China, see it for yourself. If you can't, meet Chinese people locally where you're based, because there are Chinese people everywhere. I've never been to a place where there are not Chinese people just about. So it's a great adventure, and don't give up.
Well, Robert, that's good advice. Well, I appreciate you taking the time here to share your story with us. And, I'm so glad that we actually had the chance to meet, the other month.
That's great. Thank you.
And glad that we finally got you here on the show, too, to get your full story.
Thanks, Jared. And you did a great job in England, so keep up the good work. We'll have you back anytime.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, hunter, cliff jumper, trainer, philanthropist, skydiver, sensei, mojo dojo, casa, house architect, and the one guy named Ken. Please subscribe to our podcast, share it with a friend, and if you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review. You can also reach out to us on MandarinCompanion.com or Mandarin Companion on social media. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor for this episode is Kaiser Guo. And I'd like to thank our special guest, Rob Neal, and of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Pasden. I'm Jared Turner. See you next time.